In October 2013, in Astana, Kazakhstan, Xi Jinping announced the Silk Road Economic Belt and Maritime Silk Road. With multiple name changes, it's commonly called the Belt and Road Initiative. Starting in Chongqing in central China, the BRI brings goods from China and the Chinese coast to Europe through rail and road links in Russia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and various economic corridors through Indochina and Africa, costing from an estimated 900 billion to 8 trillion. Notable projects include the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, costing around 50 to 60 billion US dollars, that will bring a port upgrade and port construction to Gwadar, with multiple road and rail links to the from the Chinese border to the Pakistani coast, and power plants and solar plants and all these sort of things to help aid the Pakistani people and the chronic power shortage problem. The Bangladesh, India, China, Myanmar corridor and the Indo-China Economic Corridor are supposed to boost regional unity, growth, and stability of each nation. As the project continues, some key criticisms have come up. What is the project's history? What are the criticisms being made against China, Chinese banks, and industrial groups? China is undergoing a foreign policy reconstruction. For most of Chinese history, the nation never really concerned itself with outside affairs. It kept itself within the Asian Pacific, only really dominating its region. Border nations would pay tribute to Chinese dynasties, and that was the extent of Chinese foreign policy. Then came the century of humiliation, from the Opium Wars with Britain and the West, losing land in northern China to Russia, having to open up borders to Western trade, and having a huge opium problem because the British would smuggle in opium, and then also having to cede Hong Kong and Macau to the British and Portuguese. From that to the repeated Japanese invasions, World War II, the rape of Nanking, where the imperialist Japanese forces murdered and raped huge numbers of Chinese women. There are many examples the Chinese bring up, but those are the particularly bad ones. Up until Xi Jinping, it was still kind of Chinese policy to not really be concerned with worldly affairs. They kind of just sat on the sidelines, rapidly developed into what China is now, but Xi Jinping is changing all that. From flexing their military might in the South China Sea, with their economic might in the Belt and Road Initiative, with a growing presence in Africa and the Middle East, and contending for regional power with Japan and South Korea, but also the United States. People think that China wants to rule Asia. I doubt that, but that's the great power game. China is taking a loud, strong, and firm stance on the world stage, and it's challenging the American domination of the Pacific. The Belt and Road Initiative is a perfect way of flexing the huge economic might the Chinese have built up over the past few decades since market liberalization, and that gets into the next issue. Chinese nationalism is threatened with the movements of Tibet and Xinjiang. Tibet has huge reserves of metals and minerals like copper, iron, gold, and crystal, but the most important things about Tibet are water and a buffer against India. Most of the water Chinese agriculture and Chinese people live on source in Tibet. China wants to double its hydroelectric power by 2020, so damming up the Yellow, Yangtze, and Mekong rivers is vital to that plan, and making sure they control the source of those rivers is key. Tibet also acts as a buffer zone against any kind of invading Indian army. The area is large with little infrastructure to support invading armies, but now that China controls Tibet, China is now right up against the Himalayan mountains, an even better buffer zone that no army would dare cut through. So what the Belt and Road is trying to do, including Tibet into the projects, and build key industrial, transport, and tourist hubs, is to promote growth, stability, and jobs in the poorest province in China. So it's extremely important China keeps Tibet stable and under Chinese control. Xinjiang is a Muslim-majority province that has been quite troublesome to the Communist Party. The Uyghur people want independence and face religious-based oppression from the central government due to their state-imposed atheism policy. The independence movement has been labeled a terrorist movement, been blamed for terror attacks in China, and are regularly put down and silenced from the outside world. So funding infrastructure, building a Central Asian trade and travel hub in Xinjiang for the Central Asian and Pakistani corridors is key to regional stability. Like Tibet, Xinjiang has always been a great buffer zone against military invasion, with a long and high mountain chain bordering Central Asia and the Gobi Desert. Xinjiang has always been a key asset to China throughout history, and especially when tensions with the USSR started to rise, and even blew up in a small border war after the Sino-Soviet split. When it comes to resources, Xinjiang holds about 38% of the country's coal reserves, and China being heavily dependent on coal for the near future, that is very important. 25% of its oil and natural gas and large reserves of iron ore, gemstones, and other metals are also in Xinjiang. So again, key for the resources. In order to keep these provinces within China, they're trying to build and have jobs within these provinces, and these are some of the poorest provinces in China. So by building infrastructure, by creating jobs and promoting regional growth, this will help kind of, what the Chinese Communist Party hopes, that this will help stave off anger at the government and kind of lessen the independence movements. China wants to operate on what they call win-win diplomacy. They want both sides to benefit from these projects, with the construction of road and rail links to the Indian Ocean through Myanmar and Pakistan, and also the upgrade or construction of ports. Not only do these countries get better infrastructure to grow their economies and have their resources and products reach the markets easier, they now have a more skilled labor force who are trained in construction and such. China also now has naval and economic capabilities there. Building ports in Pakistan and Myanmar cuts oil shipping and goods trade shipping down significantly compared to having it go through the pirate-infested and clogged Straits of Malacca. This also gets into the Kra Canal issue, but that's for a later video. 80% of China's oil imports from the Middle East and North Africa go through these straits, and in case of war, that strait could be cut off, and the energy loss crippling China's military. So the ports offer a strategic way around that choke point in case of war. These countries get infrastructure and growth, China gets strategic investments and military capabilities in the Indian Ocean. In Africa, China is financing some of the best infrastructure projects on the continent, like construction of a port in Tanzania, rail links on the Nigerian coast, and rail links in Ethiopia, Uganda, and Djibouti. But China is facing accusations that they're trying to make countries economically dependent on them, like Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, giving them leverage in ASEAN when it comes to South China Sea disputes. For example, in 2012 and 2016, Cambodian officials didn't like the wording of a resolution on the South China Sea dispute and blocked anything from coming out of the ASEAN meetings. China was accused by officials in ASEAN member states of economically trying to dominate Cambodia, so they now have a vote in ASEAN. By tying Cambodia to China economically, it makes it imperative that Cambodia would do nothing to anger China and hinder economic growth. Chinese companies have also been accused of sending Chinese workers to other countries instead of using workers in those countries. For example, in Central Asia, China is building pipelines, road and rail links to reach the massive oil and gas fields in and around the Caspian Sea. But native people in these countries who worked in these projects have noticed a large influx of Chinese workers on these projects and claim that these workers were imported. And according to some people, these Chinese workers on these projects brag about it. This has led to an increase in anti-Chinese public opinion in various Central Asian and Indo-Chinese countries. But with the Chinese infrastructure boom starting to slow and Chinese economic growth tapering off, China has overproduced steel and is tanking global steel prices. But instead of hindering growth, shutting down factories, and cutting jobs, the rumor is that China is trying to use this steel and use their own factories to fund this, to not slow growth and not hinder jobs and what the Communist Party has staked its survival on. So people are claiming it's kind of self-serving for the Chinese interests. With ports being built in Pakistan, Myanmar, and one built in Sri Lanka that is now owned by China on a 99-year lease due to debt problems, India fears China is trying to contain the Indian Navy and make it known that in any case of war, China has a fighting chance in the Indian Ocean with 3 major ports for refueling and supplies. India also fears China is trying to extend influence into the Indian Ocean and project its naval power. But others claim that these ports are vital to fighting piracy in the Straits of Malacca and off the coast of Somalia. Since the coast of China is so far from the African coast, a port in Pakistan would be great, but it also helps aid merchant ships and other missions with other nations. So now that we know what this is, now we know what the Belt and Road Initiative is, now we know what the history is and some of the reasons why they're doing it and some of the regional fears of what they're doing. What's the conclusion? What do I think on this whole matter? Is this a new form of Chinese imperialism? Is China entering a phase of capitalist development where they've stripped the nation of resources and trying to expand and need to start dominating other nations to guarantee resources to ensure constant development? Maybe. I mean, that's the case with capitalist countries. When you hit a late stage capitalist development, imperialism becomes kind of what you need to do. But I'm more optimistic. I think China is making questionable moves and downright dirty moves, working with leaders like Uganda, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Myanmar. These leaders don't have any regard for individual rights and freedoms. Leaders are openly bigoted and downright murderous. When it comes to Myanmar, China was exposed when the military dictatorship crumbled. Chinese firms, industry, and state businesses working in Myanmar essentially propped up the military regime and disregarded what locals were saying in terms of a hydroelectric dam that was under construction at the time. The willingness of China to work with anyone with this win-win diplomacy tactic is not something I stand behind. I think that it is my main and biggest issue with the OBOR project. I think China should make it a point to tell a country asking for a development that they need to meet a certain standard when it comes to workers' rights or something along that line. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, maybe even utopian as some people would say. But if I was in the Chinese shoes, I would use my economic leverage to advance socialism or at least the rights of workers in countries that are asking for my help. You want road or rail? Make this reform, even a modest reform. I would negotiate with these countries and form a board that would investigate which workers' rights issues could be advanced, even modestly. The issue brought up then is that they could go somewhere else with their business. Where? Western-backed institutions that have already rejected them because they don't meet and fall in line with Western ideals. But I think a slight change in how China operates its foreign business could do some damn good in terms of trying to overthrow American influence in Asia and Africa. Good.